Welcome again. Bienvenue, everyone. Thank you for being here. If we haven't met yet, my name is Megan. I'm with the Bow Valley Immigration Partnership. We're the host of this workshop, but this is just one of 14 events that are happening today across the country as part of the 2021 National Workplace Inclusion Forum. The Bow Valley Immigration Partnership operates in the Treaty 7 territory of the Stoney Nakoda Nations, including the Bearspaw, the Chiniki, and the Wesley people, the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, and the Tsuut'ina of the Dene people. The Bow Valley is also home to Métis Nation 3 of Alberta. Today, I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Qualicum First Nation and the Snuneymuxw First Nation. We will start this workshop in just a minute, but first I'd like to note that this session is being recorded. After the workshop, we'd really like to share the recording on the Workplace Inclusion Charter website and YouTube channel so that people who couldn't be here today can also learn from what Mohammed has to share. But it's also very important to us that you feel completely comfortable participating in the workshop. So we'll edit out as much identifying information as possible, and we'll explain again at the end of the session how you can contact us to let us know if you prefer that we not share the workshop. A few other housekeeping notes. We have enabled automatic transcriptions of today's meeting. You can use the closed captioning option in the controls at the bottom of your screen to control what you see. And please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A features to ask your questions at any time throughout the workshop, or you can use the raise hand feature if you'd like to speak your question. But again, remember, this session is being recorded. We'll address as many questions as we go as possible, and we'll come back at the end. My colleague Tash and I will help moderate that. Finally, we will email everyone in about a week to let you know that the workshop recordings and slide decks are available on the Workplace Inclusion Charter website. Speaking of the Workplace Inclusion Charter, today's events are designed to support employers who are advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion in their organizations, especially those who have signed or who would like to sign workplace inclusion charters. In the community surrounding Banff National Park, we created the 2017 Workplace Inclusion Charter to systemize the way that immigrant serving agencies and employers worked together. We wanted to create a list of very straightforward, practical, and important things that employers could do to support their foreign-born staff, which we hoped it would make it easier for employers to prioritize and take action on things that were important for our community. In 2020, as multicultural and multilingual businesses across Canada experienced outbreaks of COVID-19, we saw that workplaces in the Banff region were also susceptible to the kinds of cultural and linguistic factors that seem to be complicating the COVID response in those high-profile cases. At that time, we came across some truly straightforward, practical, and important advice from CCIS, who we'll hear more about in a moment, and from the health sector partners who were supporting COVID response in Alberta's workplaces. Our provisional 2020 Workplace Inclusion Charter reflected much of that advice from CCIS and the health sector. But we also realized at that time that that advice would be applicable long after the pandemic was over. That's why we're so grateful to have Mohammed Idriss, manager of Brooks and County Immigration Services, here today to share the important, surprising, and incredibly useful insights that he's learned by helping workers and employers weather the COVID storm. Over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Megan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm joining you today from Brooks, Alberta. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuits who have lived and cared for these lands for generations. We are grateful for their traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today, and those who have gone before us. But we also acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and none, who live, work, and play, and help each other steward this land, honor and celebrate this territory, as we recognize we are all treaty people. When Megan asked me to do this presentation, I thought about if 2 years ago someone told me that I will be speaking about emergency preparedness or disaster response. I would have thought, why me? But as Megan alluded to, COVID came in everything else is a history. We all became experts to a degree in working through disasters and through emergencies. And because of that, and because of actually something that happened here in Brooks that I'm going to speak about in Kargil, in JBS, and then in High River in Kargil, our organization became very familiar with this line of work, which is working through emergencies. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So as Megan talked about, I work for Brooks County Immigration Services, and Brooks County Immigration Services is a project of Calgary Catholic Immigration Society. Calgary Catholic Immigration Society is one of the largest settlement agencies in the country. I believe it's the largest immigration settlement services in Alberta. And we work with immigrants, temporary foreign workers, refugees, and provide wide range of services to newcomers to Canada. My division, or my work where I work, is under the SARIB part of CCIS. SARIB is the Southern Alberta Rural Initiative program. We have offices in Brooks, in High River, in Okotoks, in many different locations around Southern Alberta. And we have outreach services also to other rural communities. Specifically about emergencies and disasters. Last year, as we all know, COVID happened, and then suddenly we saw ourselves dealing with two of the largest outbreaks in terms of COVID in North America. In Kargil, I think it was called the largest outbreak, a workplace outbreak in North America, in Brooks here in the JBS meat plant, which was again a very large and significant number. We dealt with these emergencies and we dealt with these disasters, and we are still learning from it. And I think we will keep learning. I actually was sitting down this morning with the HR director from JBS, and it's still a moving thing, and we are learning something new every day. I actually changed something in the slides today just after my breakfast with the HR director, with the JBS HR director. So that is why I want this presentation to be more of an interaction, more of, I want to hear from you. I want to see how can we all learn from each other. So if you have anything to add, if you have anything to ask about, you can raise your hand as Megan alluded to earlier, or you can put it in the question and answer place, or at the end of the session. So emergencies do happen. This is not something new. We have had emergencies in the past, but what is changing? Few things that I would like to talk about that is changing. First of all, workplaces are becoming increasingly diverse. If you think about a workplace in North America 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it will look very different. Nowadays, workplaces are very diverse, and diversity is much more than ethnicity, although we are going to focus more on cultural and linguistic diversity today. There are other areas of diversity that actually also impact the work and the plans in how we deal with disasters. But that is one significant thing. It's going to keep increasing in terms of diversity. We talk about immigration in Canada, and we say that in the next 15 years, maybe, most of our growth, or all of our growth, is going to happen from immigration. So imagine what would a diverse place look like in 10 years from today. Another thing that we need to consider and we need to think about is the idea that diverse populations, many of, at least for now, they work in many high-risk industries. We have seen with COVID how the industries that were hit the most around, whether it is the hospitality industry, whether it is, for example, food processing and meat plants, whether it is continuing care and healthcare. These are industries, for one reason or the other, there is high risk in these industries, whether from the kind of health disasters or health issues that we have seen, or other kind of emergencies. Another thing we need to consider, we need to think about, is the idea that although we could be all facing the same storm in terms of an emergency, we are not all on the same boat. And this is something, it's a poem actually. If you can Google this poem, that's the title of the poem. We are not on the same boat. Although we are in the same storm, we are not in the same boat. And what do I mean by that? It's the idea that certain populations, certain groups may have less advantage in terms of, for example, network of support, in terms, for example, social capital, in terms, for example, financial leverages, and think that they can rely on to weather a storm like this, versus other population that may have leverages and may have support and may have other things that they can rely on. So all of these things makes emergency preparedness and emergency planning and emergency response a little bit more complex than what things used to be in the past. Actually, one thing I want to add here to this slide is the idea that emergencies, although emergencies are also happening, there is a change even in the pace, in the trends around emergencies. I was listening to the news recently, and they said that in the States, although it's a statistic from the state, that a couple of years ago, they used to see a major disaster or a major emergency, and they call a major emergency anything that cost over $1 billion or something like that. That used to happen every 18 months. While now, for example, they see major emergencies happening within less than 12 months from each other in average. So our environment is there. And now with this health pandemic, I was listening again to another speaker recently that was saying, they predicted there will be a huge health pandemic in the last 5 years or so. This is 5 years ago, but they may think that the next one is going to be in less than 5 years or something like that. So all of these kind of things makes us understand and makes us think that emergency preparedness in the next phase of our work or this is going to be a little bit more important and significant. Actually, another thing also I wanted to share is that because of that, in terms of, for example, different kind of accreditations and things like that, for example, businesses in industries that has accreditation systems, you are now audited and reviewed for your emergency planning and emergency preparedness as part of your accreditation. For example, my organization, CCIS, is an accredited organization. And although we are accredited as a non-for-profit organization, as part of the accreditation, they actually had to do a lot of audit around our emergency plans and around emergency preparedness for our workplace. So considering all of this and considering what we are talking about, there is this idea of culturally competent response. Culturally, how can we create in this diverse workplace, in this changing trends around emergencies? How can we create a culturally competent response? So what is cultural competency? People talk about cultural competency, cultural awareness, cultural understanding, cultural knowledge, and these are all terms that have slightly different meanings, and we could talk about that in a different presentation. But let's focus today on what cultural competency is. I have tried to look at a number of different definitions, and I think this is one of the definitions that I found that is close to what we are talking about, and it actually gives us a good understanding of what a culturally competent response could be. And it talks about the ability of individuals and systems to respond respectfully and effectively to people of all cultures, classes, races, ethnic background, sexual orientation, and faith or religions in a manner that recognizes, affirms, and values the worth of individuals, families, tribes, and communities, and protect and preserve the dignity of each. There are many things that we can learn from this definition. And one of those is the idea of response, an effective and respectful response. You need to have an effective response because you are dealing with emergencies and you are dealing with people's lives and people's livelihood, but also you need to have a respectful response, understanding and affirming these differences and being aware of them, and respecting people's dignity and showing that we can do it that way. So then when we look at the idea of cultural competency, and we look at the idea of emergencies in putting these two together, I actually believe there are some factors, there are some core principles that we need to be aware of and we need to recognize. First, we need to be aware and accept the differences. We need to be aware that there are differences and we accept these differences. Differences doesn't mean that there is a right and wrong. Differences means that we are just different people and we have different backgrounds. But we also need to be aware of our own cultural values and our own cultural biases. And these are very important to consider in emergencies. We have seen, for example, videos in situations where that bias, that own cultural bias and own cultural values have impacted the delivery of a health service, for example. We all hear about, for example, the treatment of indigenous people in the health sector, coming from some biases that health service providers may have regarding that community. We also need to understand and manage the dynamic of difference. And the idea of the dynamic of difference is that, how can we live together, work together, and have these differences and still be able to have a productive relationship, a productive environment. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. The idea of developing your cultural knowledge, or the idea of that, it's not that only understanding that and being aware that there are differences between us, but also what are these differences? How can these differences impact the work that we do? How can these differences inform the work we do? How can these differences be a positive or a negative in the work we do? This is very important, and I'm going to again touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. And then finally, the idea of adaptability. In all of these four principles, at the end, makes it easy to be able to adapt to different situations, to different cultural contexts based on that. So how can we do that in amalgamate or align or make it into alignment between the two? I think cultural competency is something that is a lens we should look at all of the stages of emergencies from. So in our planning stage, cultural competencies should be a lens that we look at the plan. In our response, cultural competency should be a lens that we use to gauge our response. And then finally, in the recovery, cultural competency should be a lens or a perspective that we plan and we recover through. It's not only one of these three, it's actually all of them that need to be looked at from the lens of cultural competency. And I'm going to try to do that in the next few slides. In planning, I think it's about knowledge, it's about planning well. And there are a couple of things that you need to do in your plan. In one of these things, or actually one of the very first things, is to know your people. The demographics, the cultural backgrounds, the belief systems, the language, all of these kind of things does impact your plan. So it's very important for you to consider all of these. And you may ask why. People act and behave coming from their backgrounds and their belief in their language, and all of these things affect that. For example, if we look at the idea of lifestyle in the COVID situation that we had, there was a lot around, for example, things like carpooling, things like living together in the same place, people sharing accommodation, and all of these kind of things impacted results at the emergency. For example, there were people who couldn't go to work because the person that they are carpooling with is someone that is impacted by COVID. So then you are not only dealing with people who are impacted by COVID, but you are also dealing with people who are impacted by COVID because the person that they are carpooling with is not there. The idea of shared accommodation, this was a big thing here in our community, to the degree that we actually had to establish hotels as isolation centers. We couldn't do it in people's houses because if you left the person there, you are impacting the whole people who are sometimes not from the same household, but they're just living together accommodation situation. So you're impacted other people's work, other people's life, and things like that. Status in Canada. It's very important for you to know if your people are permanent residents or temporary foreign workers or refugees. For example, the idea of being someone coming from a refugee background will tell you a lot around trauma, around how they deal with resiliency and emergencies and things like that. The idea of temporary foreign workers and the vulnerabilities of temporary foreign workers, in the sense of, you know, being scared about their status. If they are not working, is their status valid or not valid, and if they needed to, you know, leave the country or not, or things like that. Language is very important, of course, because when emergencies happen and you need to communicate with people, you need to understand what first languages are in your place, and how many people in your place, or what is the percentage of people in your place that understands and function well with English or not. Believe in faith. Believe in faith actually talks about how we look at emergencies and how we look at disasters. There are certain beliefs in faith around disasters that impact how people react to it. For example, the idea of contagious things, and some people believing that, you know what, it's God's will. If I get it, I get it. If I don't get it, I don't get it. And that impacts how they act around safety measures, and the idea of, you know, when we tell people, oh, you actually can't deal with or can't talk to your family or your friends or this because they may be contagious, or this could be something that affect your health, that faith sometimes plays a role. So it's very important for good planning to actually have a good understanding of who is in your team, who is your people, in what, in their lifestyle, in their culture, in their language, in their faith, that impacts how they look at disasters, and how they look at, for example, another thing I wanted to bring here is the idea of pain and pain tolerance. It is cultural. Even pain and pain tolerance is cultural. We go to the hospital, for example, and they tell you from 1 to 10, what's your pain? I actually have seen people that maybe who look in more pain versus people who look in less pain, that give different kind of numbers. And there are some cultural background around that, and around tolerance, and around you are a man, you are a woman. So there are many things that could impact that. Number 2, know your emergency. Emergency natures are changing. And although this is a little bit more general, I will also connect it with the multicultural, multilingual workplace in a minute. Anyhow, so knowing the emergencies, there is the usual suspects. There is either it's a fall in the workplace, or a burn, or a fire, or things like that. But as I talked earlier, there is the new trend around emergencies that we are seeing in our province. For example, we have seen fires, floods, the floods in Calgary, the fires in Fort Mac, and these incidents are changing now and becoming more and more short-term versus long-term. There is the emergencies that we are living in right now, the idea that we have been in emergency for now almost 2 years, going to 2 years, but also there is the idea of emergencies that you need to deal with that are short-term. And the next two are the main ones that I'm thinking about. Emergencies outside the workplace and emergencies abroad. In the global village that we are living in now, in this when we talk about the world as a global village, something that's happening in an earthquake that's happening in the Philippines, for example, may impact your work. A coup that happens somewhere in South America can impact your work. If, for example, I know some workplaces that have 20-30% of their workforce from that one community. So when something happens at home, it does impact your work, but also vice versa. One of the things that we always consider here in our community with the meat plant, and with having almost 80% of the meat plant workers from newcomers, if there is an explosion or some sort of a poison release or something in the workplace here, imagine the amount of calls or the amount of and people are not maybe able to connect with. There is a cut in communication and people are not able to connect with people here. Imagine the amount of calls and the amount of people around the world that will be worried about workers here or about people here. Imagine the phone calls that the company is going to deal with or things like that. So in knowing your emergencies, not only knowing the type of the emergencies in the usual suspects, as I said, but it's also understanding that right now in these workplaces that we are in now, there is an interrelationship between what happens inside work and what happens outside the work, and the impact of emergency on your staff, on your workers, and on the community that they are living in could be much more complex than how things were in the past, where emergencies are dealt with in a very different way. So that is why I always talk about the idea of expect the unexpected. Who would have thought a few years ago that you need to plan and think about things that could happen across the globe in a different country? That is another important thing to think about.
Mohammed, would now be a good time for a question?
Let me finish this section and then we will. Okay. And I think the major section is in the planning, and then the other two sections will be shorter. I think we have just 2 slides or so left. Know your community. It's very important to know your community and to align your plans with your community plans. So for example, here in our community, one of the things that made it very successful is the idea that there was actually a community response committee for newcomer, like an emergency response committee for newcomers and what was happening in the community around that. So JBS, the meat plant, had someone actually as part of our community, and they aligned their plans with our plans. So it wasn't going into silos; it was going in one direction. It's very important for you as a workplace to know what's happening in the community, know the resources, know who are the main ones that impact you and connect with them. And then the idea of corporate citizenship. Invest in your community. It's very important for the workplace to be a citizen of the community that they are living in, and be part of that community's plan. And we talked earlier about how the inside impacts the outside and vice versa. This is the last slides in planning in that early stage. Engaging your team. It's very important to engage your team. By your team, I mean people who work in your workplace, and especially make the team diverse. Having a health and safety committee that all look like each other, that all have the same background, will make it less effective than, for example, making your health and safety community much more diverse. And then another thing I want to talk about in this slide is the idea of training and bringing the culture of safety in the workplace. One thing you need to think about and you need to be careful about is the idea of drills, simulations, and trainings. And we talked earlier about knowing your people, and it's not the same way around the world how we do drills and how we do trainings. The idea of, for example, making a full simulation in panic and people evacuating and all of that is not very common. We have these theories around adult learning and how adults learn, and we do these things. But in other places, the idea of table topics in a classroom settings and trainings are more, and especially when you consider refugees and some of the trauma they have gone through, it is very important to go carefully with the idea of drills and simulations and things like that. Let's see if there are some questions here, Megan, and then we can go forward.
Great, thank you. So fascinating already. So Jenna asks, how can you understand who's on your team while avoiding making inappropriate assumptions or asking inappropriate questions?
That's actually a very good question. And the idea of knowing your community or knowing your people is clearly to avoid assumptions. Okay, so you can do that. Like first of all, you can do it directly by having presentations, by having profiling. For example, we have people from like put this map, for example, and put dots on everywhere that you have people from, and then ask the people to come in and talk about their cultures, their background, their understanding of emergencies, how do they deal with it, ask questions, let people have as part of the safety trainings and things like that. This is being incorporated in that. And again, when you have people from the diverse population on your safety teams, on your health teams, on your emergency teams, they can coordinate that, and they can. The basic idea is to actually, first of all, start from a place of culture of knowledge seeking. I do not know what I do not know, and you are here. You are the expert. You teach me. You tell me what you want to tell me.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Any other questions or any other, thing that comes to mind? Okay.
I don't see any here, but something maybe you might be coming back to this, but personally, I'd love to hear more about, for those of us in the Bow Valley. There was an observation in 2020 that some people who were fluent in English struggled to follow emergency guidance in English during the pandemic, apparently because of the complexity and because of how emotionally loaded that was. Can you speak a little bit about that? The need to know what languages people speak, and whether employers need to be aware of those languages, even if all of their staff are also fluent in English.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to speak a little bit more about communication during an emergency. In a couple of slides, but it's very important to go back to not even because of newcomers only, but in general, because of the speed of things, and because of the complexity of things, and because of the emotional height of things during emergencies. It's very important to have very simple, very direct very clear messages during emergencies. There is this book called the Fog of War. In when you are in war, similar to when you are in emergencies, there is this fog that happens that makes things not clear for everyone. There are rumors going on. There are things that are not based on any evidence or anything going on. So you need to have simple, clear language. And I'm going to talk also even about science. Is there anything that's called universal science? In that in a minute.
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay. So we come to. We have planned well. In basically one of the main focus on our plan was to try to learn and to try to know what we don't know and put the plan. Then we come to the response, and I think one of the main elements in response is taking action in communicating that action. So in terms of response, some of the insights that we have learned is that first, responding early. Responding early is very important because sometimes emergencies, by the way, do have like you can see it coming. You can see it coming, even if it's not there yet. I was talking to someone. We, like, for example, numbers in the States were increasing quickly compared to numbers here, for example, in COVID. So did we miss first few weeks of COVID, for example, that we could have done some good responses, although we didn't have the numbers that were in the States? Or why didn't we move? Even talking about some plans in some companies that, for example, will have a plant somewhere else in the world, in a plant here in Canada, and then that plant somewhere else in the world was starting to see issues with COVID in cases. So why didn't that inform us that it is coming in getting ready here? And sometimes it's the idea of, you don't want to create a public pressure, and you don't want to create a narrative of some sort. No, you are just delaying that and making it worse. The idea of responding early is, I think, one of the main lessons that we have learned from the COVID, and I think from any other emergency. I always have this idea around non-urgent important things. And I always say, if we focus a lot on the non-urgent important things, we will stop it from becoming an urgent important thing. So think about it. Focusing our work on non-urgent important things. For example, if you have a good plan, you will not have to rush quickly, do something quickly when things become that dire. So the idea of responding early is one thing. And then the idea of communicating. And I think if you do these two things well, respond early and communicate effectively during an emergency, you will be way ahead of everyone else. So you need to think about what is the best way to communicate with your workforce. And again, being a multicultural workforce, being in a place that is diverse, it could be sometimes not one way, it could be multiple ways. Okay, one of the things that we found out is that, and actually this is again not only a multicultural issue, it's actually even a generational issue. I have people that are in that younger age demographic. They don't talk on the phone. Like if you don't text, if you don't DM or whatever in social media, this idea of a phone is not the best way to communicate with them. With newcomers, it is all these apps that we found that they are connected to more than other things. Apps like WhatsApp or Viber or this other one called I forgot the name now. Anyhow, but these social media apps, in mainly because maybe that is the main thing that they use to call home and things like that. So sometimes their numbers will change, like their main phone number will change, but their app will still be there. So first of all, you need to have a good contact list, a good communication. For example, how to contact. Like in your database, you should have the way to contact the people. And sometimes that database need to be updated all the time. Another thing that we have seen during the emergency last year is that a company we were working with, we talked to them, and we talked to them for a while to be able to have access to their employees and get connected to them. And then finally, after days of talking about this, they gave us a list of their employees with their addresses and phone numbers, and more than half were wrong, were out of date. So people change their phone numbers, people move, and they don't update their phone number or their address with the company. So how can the company or the workplace should be able to create a system whereby these contact information be up to date? It could be something that they do, for example, during an annual performance review, where it is one more thing to check, rather than, for example, many companies now have databases of employees, and you get an email, please log into your employee file on the database and update it if you have any update. Nobody does that, including like I myself, for example. One time went into one of our database to update my information, and I found that like there is something that I have actually changed already 2 times, but my old information was there, although this is the 3rd change. So it's very important to have an up-to-date contact information, but it's also very important to have what is the best way to communicate with your workers. Is it the phone? Is it email? Is it social media? What it is exactly? The idea of universal signs or universal signals, you know, I actually now believe that there is nothing called universal signals or universal signs. I remember once going to a workplace interview with someone, and part of that was a a vision check. So they had this letters kind of thing, but the person that was doing the interview or the candidate was illiterate. So when we told them, by the way, the candidate is illiterate and doesn't know how to read letters, they actually were ready. They had something else that had some sort of like pictures and things like that, and they asked the person to answer this, and the person actually didn't know these things. Didn't know what a cup picture looked like, or these art clips, what an art clip of a cup looked like, what an art clip of a man or a woman looked like, or what an art clip of this or that looked like. Why? Because first of all, they are not universal, and then people's literacy and people's familiarity with these kind of things are different. So even things like the signal of danger or the signal of don't enter and things like that are very different from one culture to another culture and from one place to another place. So I think it's a conversation that needs to be looked at in the planning stage. How can we create a system that we in the workplace understand, and make that, look at that as something that is more than just general signals, but it is something that we need to consider that, you know what, universal signals are not universal. Clear messaging. It's very important to have clear messages, and we alluded to that just a minute earlier around why we need to have simple, clear, and maybe even one message or one idea per message, rather than comparing or putting 2-3 things together. In one of the issues that we had with COVID is that messages were very, very complex, like as recent as the idea of the vaccine passport. So there was a rule that was going to be from September 20th to somewhere, I think October 5th something, and then October 4th, I think, and then there was another rule that was going to be from then till October 15th, and then there was another rule that was going to be after end of October, which is you had to have both doses. And we were working with a workplace that wanted us to put these messages in some sort of translation form so that it can be put on in the workplace. And I looked at it and I thought that is very complex. Like, and it said, you know, if it is between, if your visit to the place is between September 20th and October 4th, you should have at least one vaccine or a 72-hour test. If it was between October 4th and whatever, I don't remember the date, I think October 20th or something, you should have at least one dose. And if it is after this, you need to have both doses. So I said, why don't we just say, you know, anybody that's coming in needs to have evidence of like doses or a negative test, and just leave it at that. So sometimes the idea of complexing these and putting many different things together makes it very complex for people to understand the message. So put it one message, simple, easy English, and if there are other languages that are important in your place, again, in easy, simple language that are not complex. Another thing that's very important during response and again, it goes with the idea of having all these different cultures and different languages in your place, is that try to differentiate between facts, rumors, people's perceptions, people's interpretation, in make your decisions, make your response evidence-based response. And again, we have seen that in COVID, where things were mixed between politics sometimes, and between evidence-based sometimes, and between public pressure sometimes, and all of that made it worse. One final thing in the effective response, the idea of, and it goes with the idea of messaging, and it's very specific for newcomers. Newcomers, interestingly enough, has this always, they are easy to feel they are guilty, or it is their fault, or there is something that they have done wrong, or things like that. It's very important during emergencies to tell people that it's not their fault. And you actually even go further in valuing them, in showing them that they are valued and they are cared for. In the example I have here is again from the community here around the JBS issue. There was all these signs all over the city that saying, you know, we value you. You feed us. You are a critical worker, and that actually impacted even the whole community. I have heard from someone that said that they have lived in Brooks for this many years, working in JBS, and nobody had ever told them anything. But during that time, when all these messages around, you know, we value you, it's not your fault, was going on, he was in the grocery store, and this old local person stopped him because he saw the jacket that said JBS, and told him, you know what, thank you for the work you are doing. Versus, for example, we hear about stories with Asians, other places around the world, or even in our country or in the States, where we're blamed for COVID, or it actually increased the racism against our Asian brothers and sisters, just because some messaging went from some leaders that made it sound something else. So it's very important in emergencies to tell people that it's not their fault. Emergencies happen. And of course, there is time at the end. If it's an emergency that was a man-made emergency, there is a time at the end for debriefing and to think about that. I see that there is a question. Can we look at it?
Yes, let's. So the question is anyone aware of where a community can source ideogram signage for reception centers?
when I was doing this presentation, I actually went to Google and tried. There are some funny ones that you know, if you say multicultural science around the world, there are that. But actually, it's a good thing that someone maybe can look at it and see if there are ways we can find that out and use some of that. But I'm not aware of.
Okay, so we'll look into it, and if we find anything, we'll send it around to attendees of this workshop.
Okay. Why is my slides not going? Okay, so we come to the last stage, which is the recovery stage, and I think support is the word that comes to my mind. And what do I mean by that? You know, research shows that the pace of recovery is different from one person to another person, but also it shows that with people that have multicultural backgrounds or people who have multi-barrier issues with it, like language and culture and things like that, the pace of recovery is actually much slower than other people. So we will need to support our workforce, our diverse workforce in that pace, and give them the time for healing, give them the time for being able to, you know, process this. Some of those people may have, this is not their first trauma. It could be their second or third or fourth trauma. Some people could be their very first trauma that they have never experienced something like this, and they also need that help and that support. Another thing that workplaces should really, and we touched on that a little bit earlier, is the idea of investing in the community. Like I keep talking about our community in about JBS, because they really did a lot of things right. They put $50,000 in food support last year, for example. When they heard that we are going to have isolation centers for people who cannot isolate at home, they came to us and they said, what do you need in the isolation center? And we will provide that. When we talked about housing, and in that housing is an issue, people who are bigger families are living in smaller places and things like that. They collaborated with the Habitat for Humanity, and now they are building actually a house, a 5-bedroom house that can take up to 10 people. So they're investing $300,000 there. So investing in your community, because actually that is, and why I intentionally use the word invest as rather than, you know, donate or do something like that, because that investment in the community has a return in the workforce, in your place, like you are not just spending the money as yes, it's a donation, but actually it's an investment to do better in the work. So people will have better well-being, better lifestyle, better accommodations, and then they can come to work having a better quality of life. And that increases your production. Evaluating and improving the plan all the time. We need to create a culture of knowledge, and that is what we talked about earlier, in knowing your people, knowing your community, and knowing your emergencies. Things change as employers. We need to change with that, and we need to be ready for the next big thing. Finally, the idea of mental health. Mental health is a new thing that we need to focus on from a workplace perspective as well, because there are a lot of indications that show that people who are, you know, having a better mental health situation do have better retention, better stability in the work, and better teamwork in the workplace. And with newcomers, mental health has a lot of barriers in itself. First of all, availability, and then stigma around mental health. We need to make it universal. How can we make going for a mental health therapy or for a support group or things like that as usual as going to McDonald's, for example, or just doing any other thing that you do daily. So how can you as an employer play a role in that, in support that? How can you lead by example, by showing your vulnerability and showing you are part of the team and you are also needing support? So finally, if I want to summarize, actually it's these four points for me. You need to plan well, you need to respond early, you need to communicate effectively, and you need to support always. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. That was incredibly useful, and we look forward to answering questions, and then we will also share this recording. Would you mind putting your contact information in the chat, just in case anyone wants to? Oh, we're right there. That works. Do we have any questions? Sure, we're all just taking it in still.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, well, I think if there are no other questions, we'll wrap it up a little bit early here. But yeah, can people connect with you if they have any additional questions? Okay.
Anytime.
Okay, so thank you again, Mohammed. Thank you, BCIS and CCIS, for supporting this presentation. And thank you all for being here today, for taking time out of your busy days. We certainly appreciate it. At this point, I'd like to remind everyone that portions, actually all of today's recording, will be shared on inclusioncharter.ca and on the Inclusion Charter, Workplace Inclusion Charter YouTube channel. You can withdraw consent to share that video at any time by sending us a private chat message now, or you can email us at the address that Natasha is putting in the chat box now. We will email everyone in about a week to let you know that the recordings are online, as well as any slides that we can share. And at that time, we'll ask you for feedback on this, our first national workplace inclusion forum. And because we're doing this for the first time, we'd especially love it if you could share your feedback, let us know what you liked and what we can do better next year. Finally, before you go, I'd like to remind you that registration is still open for next Thursday's networking session. This is a chance to connect with peers from across the country and share your own experiences and expertise around equity, diversity, and inclusion. We'll also be joined for this lively and interactive session for a brief Q&A with community leader and management consultant Omar Yacoub. We'll be emailing everyone soon to share Omar's incredible pre-recorded presentation. So to sign up for that, please visit the forum website, which we will paste in the chat again right now. Okay, so with that, we'll wrap it up and hope to see you all throughout the day and again next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you, everyone.